Hello and welcome to the Situation Report today. Very glad to have you joining the conversation. This is the show where we do our best to give you the information and perspectives you need to navigate an ever-changing culture. My name is Jeremy Stolnicker. I am your host. And today, as we look at those perspectives and tools we need to navigate an ever-changing culture, I'm very thankful to have on an incredible guest today. My guest, Raymond Ibrahim, is an expert on Islam and the Middle East. He is a speaker. He is a very prolific author, a teacher on these topics, and approaches all of these from a place of personal experience, being raised in part in Egypt. He speaks Arabic as well as English, of course, and has a deep understanding of these issues. He is a Coptic Christian. He talks about that in our interview. This is an issue that is very important, and it's one that it seems like our national focus has been on and then off. We're always looking at something else because there's always something else to look at. But we need to understand the relationships that we as Christians in the United States have with the Islamic community in the United States, and then understanding historically Islam in the world. And we could go back hundreds of years in our connection as a country, go back thousands of years, of course, as a global population, understanding the historical moorings and the foundations and what that means and what it looks like and where it has taken us as a globe, but certainly in the United States as well. Understanding these issues is so important. And to me, they're important for a lot of reasons. We need to see what has happened, understand what could happen. But as Christians, we always have to be reminded, and it's a shame we have to be reminded again and again and again, but we do, that if we are not willing to stand up for truth, and we're seeing this, I've talked about this a lot as it relates to the gender issues and so many of the ideological battles that we're facing right now. If we as Christians won't stand up for truth, even when it's hard and uncomfortable and when we might be canceled or pushed back, if we're not willing to stand up for truth, there is an impact. We see that happening in a lot of arenas, those with our children, and culturally, so many issues are at stake. But then we look at things like Islam and other ideologies that are seeking to really destroy, to choke out, if you will, the speech and the freedom of speech that Christians have, the influence that Christians have had, and really our ability to worship God as we believe we should. If we are not willing to stand up for truth and stand up for right, then we're going to lose those freedoms. And this is an area that so many of us have ceded ground. We refuse, for whatever reason, to look at the history, to understand the history in its current day context. And we have to understand this. And that's why guests like this are so important. I'm so grateful to be able to have on Raymond Ibrahim. This is a great conversation. It's one that needs to be expanded. Hopefully we can do more of this and go deeper, but I know that this will be a help to you and an episode that you'll want to share out with others. So without further ado, my guest today is Raymond Ibrahim. Raymond, thank you for joining me today. Really looking forward to this conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
There are, I mentioned this just a minute ago before we started, so many different directions I would love to go. And if we had 3 hours, we could probably go down all of those roads. But I want to talk specifically today about kind of the juxtaposition of Christianity and Islam and talk about some of those issues that exist. But before we do, give us your background. Very, very interesting background. You were a professional bodybuilder for a while, in addition to all of the other things that you've done. Talk about your background and how you got into writing on, talking, lecturing, and really discussing these issues.
Sure. So my family are what's called Coptic Christians from Egypt, basically the indigenous inhabitants of Egypt, which was a Christian nation before the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that a little bit.
Yeah.
But they migrated to the United States before I was born. I was born here. And they did it because of the, innate discrimination in a country like Egypt, a Muslim nation like Egypt, which has since gotten a lot worse. And like I said, I'm sure we'll get into that. At any rate, I always had an interest because of my background in not just the Middle East in general, but just the position of Christians Islamic world in general. And I grew up bilingual, so I can speak and read Arabic as well. And then in college, I really focused. My majors were in history, and including of the Middle East, but mostly ancient and medieval history, which of course a large part of it has to do with the Islam and the Islamic conquests. And you may have heard of him. I'm sure some of your audience has. Victor Davis Hanson. He was my professor at the time, and we still have a good relationship. I'm happy about that. And he was the chair of my thesis as well. And long story short, when I finished my master's degree, it was right around 9/11, 2001, and I decided to continue in more advanced degrees, including a PhD. And I went to Georgetown University, and I was accepted there, again in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And later I also pursued a PhD in Semitic languages and so forth, but I never really finished everything because I got a job at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., working in the Middle Eastern division. And that was a full-time job. I couldn't continue the school, and I got my first book contract because I found in the Library of Congress writings by Al-Qaeda that had never been translated. And that became my first book in 2007, The Al-Qaeda Reader. But so anyway, I always had a personal interest in these topics because of my own background, and also a sort of academic and professional interest. It's what I studied as well in school, linguistically, historically, theologically, when it comes to both religions, Islam and Christianity. The bodybuilding detour, that's when I was very young. That was I was a football player, and I had a stack of letters this thick from colleges, playing linebacker and defensive end. But I tore my ACL, my knee, and I still liked lifting weights, so I tried to find some sport to gravitate into because I was into weightlifting, and the only thing I really found was bodybuilding, which I flirted with for a couple of years. But I did win the Mr. Los Angeles in 1993, I think. And that was it. I've since tried to maintain some kind of weightlifting schedule, but no more bodybuilding.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be well-rounded. You don't often talk to people who work at the Library of Congress and also played football and were involved in bodybuilding. Man, I have so many questions. I've got to organize my thoughts here, and I have questions written down, but I spent time, I was in the United States Marine Corps. I was in Iraq in 2003, and a lot of the preconceived maybe notions of the Middle East and even Islam to some extent, and from farmers trying to just have a life and take care of their families to those who we were fighting against. So much of that was shaped at that time for me. But then many people in the world, and it's interesting, after 9/11, our world's view of Islam, it was very focused on Islam, but since then it's changed so much. And even now in the Christian world, in the Christian community, you've heard this many, many times, I'm sure. And I know I have these conversations where Christians will say, well, we see this a little bit differently, but we worship the same God. Our goals are the same. A lot of people will say Islam is a very peaceful religion, and there are radicals outside of that, but it's essentially a peaceful religion. And you make the case, and you've written a book about this, Crucified Again. You write articles about this. You've talked about this, that really Islam is not compatible with Christianity. And in fact, Islam is at war with Christianity. Can you give a perspective on that, just as a starting point for us? It's not just that we fail to see the world the same way, or that we don't read the Bible the same way. There is an actual opposition that's taken place.
Yeah, I would say Islam, I think people today are familiar with the whole concept of fake news and all of the propaganda and the politicization going on of everything. I would say Islam is one of the oldest examples of this. This idea of it's a religion of peace, that it's just an alternate route to the same Christian God. This is all pure nonsense. It has absolutely no foundation whatsoever in theological texts of Islam and its history, which is a manifestation of the theology. The long and short of it is Islam, jihad is a central component, which is translated in English. It used to be as holy war, but it really means struggle, and that's a better interpretation because the struggle can be physical or it can be non-physical. Any struggle that helps empower Islam. Another idea that people have to understand is, unlike Christianity, which people think, church and state, very division, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God's. That idea is alien to Islam. Islam is state and religion, state and mosque. Essentially, they go hand in hand. Islam is not concerned about a person's spiritual relationship with God. They're concerned about laws. And this, you've heard the word Sharia, okay, Sharia laws. That basically means Islamic laws. And these laws are so copious and well documented and just part and parcel of mainstream Islam. And they include things like having hatred for non-Muslims. This is in the Quran. The Quran calls on Muslims to hate anyone, including your father, your mother, your wife, who's not a Muslim. You must hate them in your heart. A fatwa, an Islamic decree, came out by an Egyptian cleric, which I watched on video, saying, because in Islam, a Muslim man can marry women from the book, which means Christians or Jews, scriptuaries. But he says, even though you marry them, you still have to hate them, and you have to show them you hate them. Okay, wow. So that's in the Quran, which means Muslims believe this is the word of God, Allah. Okay, now there's so many other things that we can talk about that's in the Quran that is completely contradictory to Western civilization in general, Christian mores in particular. But that's just giving you one idea. And then the idea of jihad, which was warfare to spread Islamic rule all throughout the world, that happened right with the get-go. Begins with Muhammad himself, who his whole life was basically being a caravan raider and attacking, plundering, and killing non-Muslims. But then after him, it extends, and you get the caliphates. And all of in 1 century after Muhammad died, he died in 632 AD. From that point to 732, 1 century, you have the Battle of Tours. So in France. So what that means is, from being in Arabia, Islam spread with the sword till it swallowed up 3/4 of what was then the Christian world, which was the Middle East, Greater Syria, and all the nations that are part of it today, such as Jerusalem was part of Greater Syria, Lebanon, and these countries, all of Egypt, all the way to Morocco, North Africa, so Tunisia, Algeria, Libya. And these were major Christian centers. And so this is another point a lot of Western Christians fail to understand, which is that people today think of Europe as the Christian continent. Actually, Christianity was much more embedded in North Africa and the Middle East in the 7th century. And through violence and conquest, well documented, especially in Islamic sources, 3/4 of the Christian world were swallowed up. And also Spain was conquered at the same time, and Islam was in Spain for centuries. And then, like I said, they reached the Battle of Tours, in the middle of France, which they were trying to conquer as well. But then you had various iterations all throughout history. This is the initial 1st century. But then you had the Ottoman Turks, who became Muslim and were the great standard bearers of jihad, and they conquered Eastern Europe, the Balkans. As recent as 1683, we're talking a millennium after Muhammad, they were encircling Vienna with 300,000 jihadists, and they almost conquered it. And also with slave raids that reached Iceland, Denmark. There was an island that was occupied by Muslims in the 16th century right off of London, and they would raid all of Britain really for slaves, take them back to Barbary. America's very first encounter with Islam was in the concept, or this construct. Muslims were launched slave raids on American vessels. So America's first war as a nation after independence from Britain was with Muslims who had enslaved American sailors. And when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams met their ambassador, and he said, "Why are you doing this? We've never done anything to you." He said, "It's in our Quran. You're an infidel. We have to hate you. We have to enslave you. We have to wage jihad, etc., etc." It's 1,000 years moving fast forward. For anyone who's interested, by the way, I cover all of this in one of my books. It's called Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. And I go every chapter from the beginning up until really the colonial era of all the major warfare and battles and really the vast changes that it had that people are so unaware of, including on the West. The word the West was originally coined to term Europe as the westernmost bastion of Christendom that was not conquered by a surrounding and all-engulfing Islam. So that's a little bit of history and the theology, like I told you. It's so, so as far as Christianity, Islam, the confusing part or the tricky part to Christians is Islam actually speaks well of Jesus. He's a great prophet. He's born sinless. He's a virgin birth and all this. So it does sound like there's a lot of commonality. But when it comes to the central core teachings and the most important teachings of Christianity, Islam vociferously condemns it. It doesn't believe Jesus was even crucified. Someone else was crucified in his place at the last moment. So it also means he didn't die and he wasn't resurrected as well. And these are central to anything about Christianity. And historically, if you look again, and it comes out in all these books, the chief enemy of the Islamic world was the Christian. In the Quran, again, it says, infidels are they who say Jesus is the son of God. Okay, and to be an infidel, that term, or the Arabic term, a kafir, in the singular, is basically it's basically saying that person is free game to murder at will or enslave. Okay, so that's what a Christian is, unless they pay tribute and they live in submission to Islamic rule and they live according to a host of debilitating social strictures. Okay, so that's the long history of Islam, and then it's still happening today. Anyone who actually leaves the mainstream media and finds an actual accurate news source will see Muslims still saying the same sorts of hateful things, Muslims attacking and destroying especially churches, engaging in the same mentality, quote, justifying it through the Quran and Muhammad's example, and so forth, while we have another strain of thought dominated by academia and Western media telling us, no, Islam is peace, and you started all the problems with the Crusades.
Yeah, right.
And the Crusades, by the way, were a 400-year belated response to all the jihad I had just mentioned. In fact, right before the Crusades, there was a new jihad that swallowed up Asia Minor, which was the oldest Christian region in the world. It's where St. Paul wrote all his epistles to, and now it's called Turkey, of course. But at that time, the Turks were just devastating, destroying thousands of churches, enslaving and slaughtering tens of thousands of Christians, especially Armenians, but Greeks as well. And that's what caused the First Crusade. So even the First Crusade, which people like to point to, that's the bad, mean Christians.
Yep.
Even that was a response to violence, but they don't tell you that. That's always, it's presented in a vacuum.
Hey, Situation Report, Jeremy Stolniker here. We've all heard about DC politicians and their incredibly well-timed stock trades. Well, according to veteran trader Ross Givens with Traders Agency, it's all true. These politicians have made absolute fortunes for themselves trading stocks. Ross has revealed there's a largely unknown legal loophole that allows regular people, patriots like you and me, to see when these elite insiders are buying up stocks and how to follow their lead to incredible profit opportunities. Now, Ross has been doing this for a long time. He's a former vice president of investment management at JP Morgan Chase. He's been trading stocks for almost 20 years and teaching clients how to trade their own money for almost a decade. And we've just been blown away by everything Ross has revealed, including exactly what this trading loophole is and how it works, how he's learned from these insiders for nearly a decade, and how the stock picks have gained 88% in 7 days, 234% in 8 weeks, and even 1,787% in 2 years. Go to theinsidertrades.com to start following these insiders yourself and get a free stock pick of one of the hottest symbols that is seeing huge insider buying right now. That website is theinsidertrades.com to see when these political insiders are buying stocks and get your free stock pick. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. It's such a long history. You mentioned, a lot of folks don't know about the pirates, the Barbary pirates. In the Marine Corps, you learn this history, right? Because the Marine Corps was started actually in 1775 as a response to that. And it's in the hymn we talk about, the shores of Tripoli, and that's our history with that, going back to the beginning, even of our founding, and then you go back thousands of years. What do you do with, a lot of communities have a lot of Muslims that are peaceful people that live and coexist with others. I, for a short time, lived in the Bay Area of California, up in the Fremont area. They say there are more Afghans in Fremont than anywhere else in the world outside of Afghanistan because of the wars in the 80s. What do you do with that? So if what's normal is what we would call radical, Muslim or Islam, and the killing and all of those things, if that's normal, then what do you do with folks thousands and thousands of folks around the world that aren't that way?
Right. So that's a good point. So first of all, you have to understand that what is dismissed as radical is mainstream. That's the mainstream teaching. I'm not saying it's the mainstream behavior of every single Muslim.
That is what the Quran teaches.
That's what the Quran teaches.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Today you'll hear, for example, a terrorist, they don't represent Islam and they're just they're in some little, in Afghanistan driving pickup trucks with guns. Right. Well, historically, it was the caliphates and the sultanates and the richest, most powerful, influential Muslims who were doing this. Okay, and the ones who spearheaded it were the leading sheikhs and clerics holding the Quran, saying you have to enslave and murder and destroy churches and so forth. Okay, so that's the mainstream teaching of Islam. Now, just like with any religion, obviously you have what it is, and then you have what people do, and
Right.
there's a whole spectrum of what a nominal Muslim can and cannot do. Do they accept all of that? Okay, maybe there are, sure, lots of them. Do they not? Do they not know about it? Do they not care? Are they more interested in living, in the now? Of course, there's those as well. So I think the key point is, yeah, you can have what they call a moderate Muslim, but he's really, or she is not necessarily, he's not moderate because Islam is moderate and he's following that brand of Islam. He's just moderate because it's, for whatever reason, it's secondary to his life in the now. And also, there's one caveat, which is Islam actually promotes this sort of circumstantial Islam. So the Quran itself and Muhammad, they say if you're in a weakened position, you're not supposed to go on jihad, and you are supposed to smile in the face of the infidel, and you are supposed to pretend friendship. And this is a whole doctrine. There's many doctrines. Well, the most famous is known as taqiyya in Arabic, and that's also rooted into the Quran and in Muhammad's life teaching. And I'll just give you one example again, a page from history. So I mentioned earlier that Spain was conquered in the 7th century by Muslims, and there was it was completely conquered, and there was a small pocket of Christian resistance, and that became what's called the Reconquista, the reconquest. So century after century, the Christians holed up in the north, ended up going south, and eventually they conquered the whole of Spain, except for Granada at the very southern tip. And that was really the bastion of Islam, of Spanish Islam. And in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, they actually gave those Muslims a right to be Muslim, do what you want, live in your own life, enforce Sharia in Granada. But you had to follow the rules, okay? But they didn't. And whenever they had a chance, they would, again, do the jihad and attack Christians and destroy and rape and pillage, okay? So eventually the Spanish crown concluded the only way for you people to remain here is you have to become Christian. And that was less because the Spaniards were crazy, fanatical Christians, and more because they understood as long as they're Muslim, they will have this existential animosity for us, because they understood what the Quran was all about and its views, etc. And so what happened is a leading cleric gave 500,000 Muslims, that's what we're up in Granada, a fatwa saying, yeah, you can convert outwardly. Okay, you can go and participate in, have baptism, Eucharist, go to church, all of that, and you can curse Muhammad, make the Spaniards trust you, as long as in your heart you're still a good Muslim and you're trying to subvert Spain back to Islam.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
And this went on for centuries, to the point we have records of Spaniards saying they were better Christians than us. They went to church more punctually. They took the Eucharist. They were seen teaching Sunday school or the equivalent thereof, and yet in their hearts they were preaching hatred and jihad. And that's when push came, and that's, by the way, what led to the Inquisition, because it was so hard to determine who was the true Muslim doing this and who wasn't. Okay, that's the initial phases, at least in Spain. So I'm just giving that as an example that even in Islam, Muslims are taught that if they're in a bad situation and they're outnumbered, then they shouldn't expose themselves, obviously, as long as they still have the animosity and so forth. Again, but having said all that, I'm not saying every single born Muslim feels this, because this isn't a genetic thing, it's an ideology.
Right.
And depending on how much the Muslim in question believes in that ideology, it will affect him.
Yeah. And we see this in the Christian world as well. There are people who hold to the doctrines of Scripture and, line on line, precept on precept, and those who don't. Yeah. And it's funny because those who do are viewed as radical, right? And those who don't.
Right. Fundamentalists.
Right. And the ones who don't, though, are liberal. They've left the teaching of Scripture to behave in another way.
Right. So as a Christian, you can say those Christians are wrong, but they still exist. They still exist, right? So it's the same thing with Islam. I mean, Muslims will tell you that the so-called moderate ones are obviously on the wrong path. That is, if they're truly moderate inside and out. But they still exist. There's no denying that, and that's a good thing, obviously.
What has happened in our country, and I can't speak for anywhere else, but in the United States, where the view of Islam has become so positive? And again, after 9/11, that was not the case for at least a short time, but it's become so positive. And it's crazy to me as a Christian. If I, as a Christian, do something that is counter to mainstream, we could look at, if I talk about, gender ideology and those kind of things, I'm viewed as hateful, I'm pushed off in a corner, I'm silenced or canceled or whatever. But a Muslim who holds, many of those same political or conservative, we'll call it cultural views. Not so much. How does that happen, or how has that happened in the United States?
Well, I think that's part and parcel of the overall changing culture in recent years, which is basically this idea that has sort of metastasized in all the official channels, academia, the media, movies, which is, to put it crudely, white Christian people are bad, especially men, okay?
Yeah.
And everyone else is good. And so I think that's the paradigm that Islam fits into it. So, okay, same thing, most Muslims are not white, or at least they're not seen as white, and they're not Christian, okay? So even though you're right, Islam is actually much more draconian towards, let's say, homosexuality than Christians are.
Right.
You'll find leftists and homosexuals and so forth allying with Muslims. And in the end, I think it's because, and I always say this, it's the idea of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah.
So the real enemy of what we call the West is sort of, Christian, European traditional culture. And so it's allying with anyone and everyone who's its historic enemy and who can help somehow bring its downfall, I think.
You've written...
Excuse me.
That's right. You've written recently, and again, we talked about this briefly before we started, on, Christians have allowed a lot of the spread of Islam or the advancement of Islam to happen, to take place. Can you talk about that? Because I throw most of our society's ills at the feet of Christians. Even though I am a Christian, I think that if we held to the truth of God's word, we would live in a very different place, and Christians have not, and so we're struggling in so many areas, and this is just another one.
Yeah, I think what I was saying, which is, and I hate that word, the left, because
sure,
but to be intelligible, I have to use it.
Yeah,
and the reason I hate it, just to be quick about it, is when we say the word the left, we really legitimize what some of these people believe, which is pure insanity, which is there's no gender, there's, men can be pregnant.
Right.
And I don't need, and because the left, you're imagining a continuum, right? You got the middle, the right, the left, okay? But this does not belong on any continuum. This is, insanity, and I'm actually still trying to be mild about it. But anyway, so we understand each other. The left, okay, has also, to a great degree, infiltrated Christianity, especially in the West. And it's done this, I think, by really pulling out of context and exaggerating the sort of passiveness which is in Christianity to a great degree compared to other religions, especially Islam. The whole turn the other cheek, forgiveness, tolerance. It's all culminated into this sort of Christian culture in the West, which I call doormat Christianity, which is basically you don't judge, you don't even distinguish in your mind, this is bad or this is good. And but that's not really Christianity.
No.
Christianity, you have, first of all the forgiveness and all this is an individual thing. It's not supposed to be part of the state. The state is supposed to, according to Christian teaching, historically, govern according to what we call, for example, just war theory, which is, the aggressor gets punished, including by death, execution, and so forth. And that was considered very Christian. But today, Christianity means you're a doormat and you don't judge and you don't say anything. But it's funny because those who promote this kind of Christianity, obviously there's some Christians, but oftentimes they're not even Christian at all. And it makes sense because they don't like Christianity, and the best way to neutralize you as a Christian is to tell you to do nothing, and your job is to be silent and shut up and take it. So you're right that Christianity or Christians in the West have contributed to this, and I think it's to a great degree by design. And this is a classic definition of the word heresy. You take something which is true in the teaching, but then you exaggerate it at the sake of something else, and that's what's going on. So Jesus is also the one who took a whip of, cord of whips and threw tables around, said be as shrewd as snakes, and buy a sword and all that sort of thing. To say nothing about the Old Testament kind of mentality, which is still part of definitely the Judeo-Christian worldview. But it's this constant watering down, and for the record, so my last book here it is, just so Defenders of the West, and this is the Battle of Tours. The picture, the painting. The Christian heroes who stood against Islam. The reason I wrote that book actually was to counter what the prevalent sort of Christianity and show that the form of Christianity that existed historically was much more muscular, much more conservative, much more concerned about protecting the innocent against the evil. And too many Christians today, they make a virtue out of a vice, cowardice, and they act as if as if they're ultimately just scared or lazy, but they say, no, I'm just being a virtuous Christian by not doing anything and not judging and so forth. And even in that book, but elsewhere, anyone can find, there's so many scriptures and Christian teachings, and not to say nothing of the history, including Protestantism. Even early Protestantism was very favorable towards the idea of just war, and even the Crusades, not necessarily the historical ones because they were much misunderstood, but even modern day kind of manifestations and so forth in those centuries. The Battle of Lepanto, for example, Protestants were very celebratory, just as the Catholics were. It was in 1571. So yeah, the long and short of it is, yes, I agree. Christianity has been wormed into, and its doctrines watered down specifically to help empower the left, Islam, or whatever you wish to call it.
That I call it the compassion argument, but it's the argument that Christians throw out when they don't want to do something, right? I don't want to do anything at the border because compassion, right? I don't want to do anything against the trans ideology because compassion. I don't want to do anything, stand up against Muslim ideology because compassion. And
the reality is they don't want to do it because they don't want to be inconvenienced.
That's exactly right.
Or canceled.
Well, and you call it cowardice. I think that's a big part of it. Either that or biblical illiteracy. I think that's also a part of it as well, right? Not understanding what the Bible says. But then that brings Christians to an interesting place. We live in the United States, and one of the things I love about the United States is that people are free to worship God as they see fit and to live the lives that they feel called to live, whether I agree with it or not. What should Christians be doing in the United States to stand for truth, to stand for right, to stand against an ideology that would destroy them if we allowed it to happen? How do we, in a country that values freedom, it's sacrosanct in the United States, it should be, how do we stand up against that which is wrong while also giving people the room to worship as they see fit?
Yeah, I mean, and you're asking it in the context of our discussion, about Islam and Muslims in America, but I would argue that it's gotten so bad. I mean, how do Christians do what's right in the context of people are now forcibly teaching their children sexual perversion and indoctrination, which is even worse, in my opinion. And I'm not seeing much of anything being done. So I don't expect them to do anything about Muslims for the very reasons that you mentioned, which is, well, this is freedom of religion, et cetera, and they can't think beyond the surface. They can't think about the topics that I said, for example, the history, the doctrine, and so forth. But there's definitely a great paralysis going on in this country amongst Christians and conservatives and those who go under the term the right, because what's happening today to this country is so blatant, and they're still not doing anything about it. Can you imagine any time in history amongst any Christian group, even the founding fathers, if you told them you have to celebrate homosexuality and sexual depravity and we're going to shove it down your throat and teach it to your children, they would have went to war about it. But today, nothing's happening and people are meekly going along. I always liken it to the analogy of the boiling frog, which and whether it's true or not, because some people say it's not true, but the theory is if you put a frog in normal water and you start boiling it slowly, it'll boil alive and it'll never jump. Whereas if you put him right away in hot water, he'll jump right up because he'll feel it. So the idea is that when something slowly and incrementally bad keeps happening to you, just get so used to it and you become more and more desensitized until the next stage gets crazier and crazier, and then you just sit there. And I think that's a very apt analogy for what's happening, especially in America.
So 2 questions or 2 parts of the same question. Do you believe Americans will wake up and start pushing back against some of these things at some point? Part 1 and part 2 is, and what happens if they don't? What happens if we don't push back?
Will they push back? I think it's going to have to get much worse, which is bad, before anything like that could happen. And I think it's plenty bad, like I said, already what's happening.
It's bad.
And the sad part is, if Americans were to do something decades ago, then there would be nothing. It would be so minor. And the more you let evil go unchecked, the worse it's going to be for all concerned. That's how wars happen. But if you were to nip it in the bud, it would have been a lot easier for everyone. But I think it'll have to get a lot worse before anything can happen. And your second question really is, will they? It'll probably be very close to too late. And I know at this point one should be optimistic, but I'm not at all optimistic. From what I've seen and what I understand about the world and how I understand history and its cyclical nature, what's happening today to the West is unprecedented. This is just pure, absolute suicide. In Europe, I follow it closely. Not a day goes by without several instances of Muslims, and especially in those regions, Western Europe, Scandinavia, Britain, Germany, Austria, constant, and manifestations of what I'm talking about: hostility, violence, attacks on churches, decapitation of, Christian Virgin Mary statue, breaking crosses. This is a nonstop, constant going on. And what are they doing about it? No, nothing. They're taking in more because that's a Christian thing to do, right?
Yeah.
I'm not. I obviously this is how history unfolds, and things get bad and then they get good, and you know that saying, how's it go? Bad times create hard men, hard men create good times create soft men create bad times. That's where we're at, right?
Yeah.
So obviously, at one point, it'll get so bad that strong men will have to eventually take over.
So you still write on all of these things, and you do a lot. I mean, you have a newsletter that goes out with great information, and you talk about this and you lecture on it. So taking it from the kind of the macro to the micro, I've tried, and I'm really trying to navigate this, right? The world is crazy, as you just mentioned, and trying to go, okay, well, I can't do anything about this, but I need to focus on, my kids and, my extended family, and I need to do the right thing for me, trying to be informed of history. And you can really project trajectory often based on what's happened in the past. What would your advice or your instruction be? Okay, maybe Americans won't push back until it's too late. Maybe it will be too late. But what can people do? Individual people who do care, what do they do on the micro level?
Well, I mean, it sounds like initially what you're saying, what can they do, realistically and practically for themselves and their families and so forth.
Yep.
Which I agree makes sense. If the whole thing is corrupted, you have to at least start with the basic unit. I think kids are especially under attack. I think homeschooling children is a great idea. With these public schools and what they're teaching, and this is how the insanity spreads. They take your kids and they turn them into psychos. Like, I just saw a video of some girl who wants to sue her parents because they want her to get a job, and she's like, "Well, I didn't ask you to give birth to me, and you did that without my consent, so I'm suing you." And she's serious. So that sort of mentality, sadly, is being socially engineered in schoolrooms, in videos, and in everything. So I think the more you can withdraw from that public influence, the better for you and your children, for one, and it will give you much clarity of thought as to what's going on in the world. And, find like-minded people and start creating small communities of like-minded, that's how it all starts, I think. And then hopefully it has a snowball effect.
Yeah, that's good. You've written an awful lot. Talk to us about the books that you've written and where to get those, where someone should start. If they wanted to, start reading your works, where they should start or where you'd recommend they start reading.
Sure. So my website, which is my first and last name.com, RaymondIbrahim.com, IBRAHIM.com, has all my articles and links to all my books as well. They go to Amazon, but you can buy them anywhere you want as well. I would argue that the best books to read are probably my two more recent ones, and they're the more successful ones as well because people like them. And they're the history ones, and they really lay out the history as well as the doctrine that you need to know. They're not extra heavy on Islamic doctrine, but they'll tell you those doctrines that are essential to understanding your, how Islam sees you and non-Muslims and Christians especially. And they are, the first one is Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West. And the more recent one, which was I was just quoting from in an article, Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes Who Stood Against Islam, which is also historical, and it looks at the spread of Islam and the violence and so forth, but it looks at it through the lens and the eyes of 8 defenders or heroes. They used to be well-known Christian heroes. Now, of course, they're bad guys, they're racist, they're xenophobes, they're colonialists and so forth. But also, my website, I write a lot of articles. Every month, I write one report called Muslim Persecution of Christians. I've been doing that for 12 years, and every month, I just collate as many of the more telling and significant stories, and there are usually at least 1 or 2 dozens around the world. And they include Muslims slaughtering Christians, bombing churches, burning churches, enslaving women and children, killing blasphemers, killing apostates. That's a monthly thing. It goes on several times. And any one of those, if it was a Christian doing it to a Muslim, it would be all over plastered the news 24/7. None of these get even a mention. I mean, most of them I get from smaller websites, foreign language websites, and so forth. But yeah, my website would be a best stop, one place stop.
Thank you for thank you for what you're doing. It is so important, and again, it's weird how this changes so quickly in the United States, at least, where we're very focused, hyper focused on this, and then we're not. We will be again, and I appreciate you writing on it, speaking on it, and spending some time with us. Thank you for doing it. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
We were not made to live in isolation. Sadly, many of our veterans feel they need to fight their battles alone. This self-isolation has led to the staggering statistic of more than 20 veterans taking their lives every day.
A lot of guys end up drinking, a lot of guys end up losing hope. Someone will go to the VA and they'll try to get, prescription medications to help with PTSD. They'll get pills for anxiety, they'll get pills because they can't sleep, now they'll get pills for depression. Before they know it, they're taking 12 different medications. And when it's not working out, these guys lose hope, and that's why there's 23 guys a day committing suicide.
The mission of Mighty Oaks is to eradicate the veteran suicide epidemic and help our warriors change their legacies. As a result, we've been able to help over 4,000 veterans and first responders by equipping them with the tools they need to live the lives they were created to live.
Everything they said just kept hitting me in the heart over and over and over again. It's like all the things that I didn't know that I needed to hear. And I opened my heart to God that week, dude, and I've been a different person ever since.
Our faith-based, peer-to-peer approach has one of the highest success rates of any program available today, offering hope and understanding to those who need it most. We provide our programs and resources, including travel, at no cost to our warriors.
I remember talking to a licensed social worker who actually handed me a pamphlet to Mighty Oaks. So I went, and I'm glad I did.
By aligning their lives to biblical principles, these men and women are able to lead their families, their communities, and our nation. Our mission is to serve and restore our nation's warriors and families who have endured hardship through their service to America, and to help them find new life purpose through hope in Christ. It's your generosity that can make a difference in the lives of the men and women who have fought for our country and our freedoms. Now that they're home, don't let them fight alone. Learn more at mightyoaksprograms.org.
Hey, Situation Report, Jeremy Stolniker here. We've all heard about DC politicians and their incredibly well-timed stock trades. Well, according to veteran trader Ross Givens with Traders Agency, it's all true. These politicians have made absolute fortunes for themselves trading stocks. Ross has revealed there's a largely unknown legal loophole that allows regular people, patriots like you and me, to see when these elite insiders are buying up stocks and how to follow their lead to incredible profit opportunities. Now, Ross has been doing this for a long time. He's a former vice president of investment management at JP Morgan Chase. He's been trading stocks for almost 20 years and teaching clients how to trade their own money for almost a decade. And we've just been blown away by everything Ross has revealed, including exactly what this trading loophole is and how it works, how he's learned from these insiders for nearly a decade, and how the stock picks have gained 88% in 7 days, 234% in 8 weeks, and even 1,787% in 2 years. Go to theinsidertrades.com to start following these insiders yourself and get a free stock pick of one of the hottest symbols that is seeing huge insider buying right now. That website is theinsidertrades.com to see when these political insiders are buying stocks and get your free stock pick. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. On MyPillow's 20-year anniversary, with over 80 million MyPillows sold, Mike Lindell at MyPillow wants to thank each and every one of you by giving you the lowest price in history on their MyPillows. You will receive a queen-size MyPillow for $19.98. Regular price is $69.98, and just $10 more for a king size. You will receive deep discounts on all MyPillow products, such as bed sheets, mattress toppers, pet beds, mattresses, my slippers, and so much more. This is the time to try out some of their other amazing products you've had your eye on. Go to mypillow.com and click on the radio podcast square and use promo code SITREP to receive this amazing offer on the queen size MyPillow for $19.98. Or call 800-870-0283. This offer comes with a 10-year warranty and a 60-day money-back guarantee. It's time to start getting the quality sleep you deserve. Go to mypillow.com and use promo code SITREP or call 800-870-0283. What a great conversation, and very thankful for Raymond's time with us, of course, and spending time writing and communicating on these issues. Such critical issues for us to understand. And as Christians, we have got to get a broader worldview. We have to understand that if we're not willing to stand up for truth and stand up for right and communicate what we say we believe, at least, many say it and don't necessarily believe it, I guess. But if you believe it and you say you believe it, you need to stand up for it, stand up for the truth of Scripture and live that out, or there will be consequences. Ultimately, those consequences will mean that the government will teach our kids whatever the government thinks is right, that other religious ideologies will supersede our ability to communicate what we believe is right, and we need to understand in its right context. I'm very grateful for folks like Raymond Ibrahim, who are willing to write and speak and communicate on these issues. Thank you again for listening and or watching. If you're not yet subscribed to the show, do that right now. We'd love to have you subscribed so that you can know when this and other episodes are pushed out live, and we want you to join us on this journey. Thank you again. Look forward to talking to you next time.